The morning sun cast long shadows across Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood before her bedroom mirror. Her hands trembled slightly as she fastened the black pearl earrings that had belonged to her late grandmother-in-law, Queen Elizabeth II. The weight of the day ahead pressed down on her shoulders like an invisible cloak. Today, the nation would say goodbye to someone who had touched millions of lives, and she and William would stand at the center of that grief, offering strength they weren't sure they possessed. The phone call had come 3 days earlier in the middle of the night. William's face had gone pale as he listened to the voice on the other end. Catherine had watched from their bed as her husband's world shifted beneath him. The beloved children's author and humanitarian Sir David Matthews had passed away suddenly at the age of 78. To the world, he was a literary giant who had brought joy to countless children through his magical stories. To William and Catherine, he was Uncle David, the man who had been a constant presence in their lives since their marriage, a bridge between the old world of royal duty and the new world they were trying to create for their children. Catherine remembered the first time she had met Sir David. It was during their engagement period at a quiet dinner party at Highgrove House. She had been nervous, still adjusting to the weight of scrutiny that came with loving a prince. David had approached her with a warm smile and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners from years of laughter. He had spoken to her not about royal protocol or public expectations, but about books, about the stories that shaped children's imaginations, about the responsibility that came with influence. The most important thing, he had told her that evening, his voice gentle but firm, is to remember that behind every title, every position, every public face, there's a human heart. Never lose sight of yours, my dear. Those words had become a guiding principle for Catherine as she navigated the complexities of royal life. David had become more than a family friend. He had become a mentor, a safe harbor in the storms of public life, and, most importantly, a beloved figure to George, Charlotte, and Louis. Now, as Catherine adjusted her black dress one final time, she could hear the sounds of preparation echoing through the castle. William was in his study, reviewing the eulogy he would deliver at Westminster Abbey. She could picture him there, shoulders tense, reading and rereading the words that could never fully capture the essence of a man who had meant so much to so many. The children were with their nanny, being prepared for what would be their first experience with public grief. George, at 11, understood the gravity of the day. He had grown quiet since hearing the news, spending long hours in his room with the collection of books Uncle David had given him over the years. Charlotte, 9, had cried openly, her young heart struggling to understand why someone so full of life could simply be gone. And Louis, at 6, kept asking when Uncle David would visit again, not quite grasping the permanence of death. Catherine made her way downstairs, her heels clicking softly against the ancient stones. She found William in the morning room, standing by the window that overlooked the gardens where David had often walked with their children, telling them impromptu stories that would later find their way into his published works. "How are you holding up?" she asked softly, placing her hand on his shoulder. William didn't turn around immediately. When he finally faced her, she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of carrying not just his own grief, but the grief of a nation that looked to him for comfort. "I keep thinking about the last time we spoke," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He called last week, excited about the new book he was working on. A story about a young prince who learns that true strength comes not from ruling others, but from understanding himself. William's voice broke slightly. He said he was writing it for George. Catherine felt her own eyes fill with tears. David had always been thinking of their children, always finding ways to weave life lessons into the magical worlds he created. His stories weren't just entertainment. They were roadmaps for navigating life with courage, kindness, and integrity. The day unfolded with the precision that marked all royal ceremonies, but beneath the choreographed movements and ceremonial protocols, raw human emotion pulsed like a hidden heartbeat. As their car made its way through London streets, Catherine watched the crowds that had gathered. People of all ages lined the route, many holding copies of David's books, some with flowers, others simply standing in silent respect. She saw a young mother holding her toddler, pointing to their car, and explaining something in hushed tones. She saw elderly couples, their faces etched with the understanding that comes from experiencing loss. She saw teenagers who had grown up reading David's books, now young adults themselves, but still connected to the magic he had created. The sight that moved her most was a group of children from a local primary school, holding a banner they had made themselves. It read, "Thank you, Uncle David, for teaching us to dream." The simple words, written in crayon and marker, captured something that the most eloquent speeches might miss. Westminster Abbey loomed before them, its ancient stones having witnessed centuries of joy and sorrow, celebration and mourning. As Catherine stepped out of the car, the weight of history and the immediacy of grief merged into something almost overwhelming. The Abbey was filled with faces she recognized. Authors, educators, fellow members of the royal family, politicians, and ordinary citizens who had won their seats in a lottery because so many wanted to say goodbye. But it was the front row that drew her attention. There, in the reserved section for family, sat David's nieces and nephews, his longtime companion Margaret, and the children from the various charities he had supported. Among them were 3 young people Catherine recognized, former patients from the Children's Hospital where David had been a patron for over 20 years. Their presence was a testament to the man's character, his belief that healing came not just from medicine, but from hope, imagination, and the power of stories to transport young minds away from pain. As they took their seats, Catherine felt the gravity of the moment settle around her like a heavy blanket. She was not here just as a grieving friend, but as a representative of the crown, a symbol of continuity and strength for a nation saying goodbye to one of its treasures. The role required her to be both utterly human in her grief and transcendently strong in her public presence. The service began with the haunting notes of Jerusalem, David's favorite hymn. The voices of the Westminster Abbey choir filled the ancient space, carrying with them the collective sadness and gratitude of everyone present. Catherine found herself thinking about all the times David had hummed that same hymn while walking with the children, his voice blending with theirs as they explored the gardens at Sandringham. When it came time for William to speak, Catherine watched her husband rise with the bearing of a future king, but in his eyes, she saw the vulnerable young man who had lost another father figure. David had filled some of the spaces left empty by Diana's death, offering William a model of how to use privilege and position to genuinely serve others. William's voice was steady as he began, but Catherine could see the slight tremor in his hands as he gripped the podium. He spoke of David's legacy, of the millions of children whose imaginations had been sparked by his stories, of the countless acts of quiet charity that had never made headlines, of the man who had taught them all that true nobility came not from titles, but from service. David understood something that we sometimes forget in our busy world, William said, his voice growing stronger as he continued. He understood that children are not just the future, they are the present. They deserve our attention, our creativity, our very best efforts, not tomorrow, but today. Every story he wrote, every hospital visit he made, every quiet moment of encouragement he offered was his way of saying to a child, "You matter, your dreams matter, your pain matters, your joy matters." Catherine felt the tears she had been holding back begin to fall. Around her, she could hear the soft sounds of others weeping, the collective release of grief that had been building since the news of David's death had broken. But there was something else in the atmosphere, too. Gratitude, love, and a shared determination to carry forward the values he had embodied. As the service continued with readings from David's most beloved works, Catherine found herself thinking about the conversations they would never have, the stories he would never tell, the moments with their children that would now exist only in memory. But she also thought about the foundation he had laid, the values he had instilled, the example he had set. The final hymn was "How Great Thou Art," and as the congregation rose to sing, Catherine felt something shift inside her. The grief was still there, sharp and immediate, but alongside it was a growing sense of responsibility. David had spent his life planting seeds of imagination, kindness, and hope. Now it fell to others to tend that garden. As they prepared to leave the abbey, Catherine caught sight of a young girl in the crowd, no more than 7 years old, clutching a worn copy of The Adventures of Princess Luna, one of David's earliest works. The girl was crying, her small face scrunched up with the kind of grief that children feel so purely, so completely. Without thinking, Catherine stopped. Protocol demanded that she continue walking, that she maintain the schedule, that she not break for the planned proceedings. But David's voice seemed to whisper in her ear, "Remember that behind every title, every position, every public face, there's a human heart." Catherine knelt down beside the little girl, her black dress pooling around her on the stone floor of the abbey. "He was special to you too, wasn't he?" she said softly. The little girl nodded, unable to speak through her tears. Catherine gently touched the book in the child's hands. "You know what Uncle David would want us to do now?" she asked. "He'd want us to keep telling stories, keep dreaming, keep believing in magic. Can you help me do that?" The girl nodded again, this time with the beginning of a smile breaking through her tears. Around them, cameras flashed, and the moment was captured, but Catherine was oblivious to everything except the connection between herself and this grieving child. In that moment, she wasn't the Princess of Wales. She was simply a woman offering comfort to a hurting child, exactly as David would have done. As they finally made their way from the abbey, Catherine carried with her the weight of the day and the beginning of an understanding about what David's death would require of them all. The grief would continue, but so would the work, the stories, the commitment to the values he had championed. The afternoon stretched ahead with more ceremonies, more public appearances, more opportunities to provide the strength and dignity that the nation expected. But Catherine felt a subtle shift in her understanding of what that meant. It wasn't about being perfect or untouchable. It was about being authentically human while serving something larger than oneself. As their car pulled away from Westminster Abbey, Catherine looked back one last time at the ancient building where they had just said goodbye to a man who had taught them so much about living. The crowds were beginning to disperse, but small groups remained, sharing stories, comforting each other, connected by their shared love for someone who had touched their lives through his words and his heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to honor David's memory through their actions. Tonight, there would be time for private grief, for family tears, for the quiet process of beginning to understand how to move forward without someone who had been such a guiding light. But first, there was this moment, driving through London with William beside her, carrying the weight of public service and private loss, knowing that they would find a way to transform their grief into something that would serve others, just as David had taught them to do. The nation's grief was real, and so was theirs, but so too was their commitment to carrying forward the light that David had helped them kindle. The days following the funeral passed in a blur of condolence letters, official duties, and the strange emptiness that grief creates in everyday life. Catherine found herself reaching for her phone to text David about something funny Lewis had said, only to remember with a sharp pang that those conversations would never happen again. The silence where his laughter used to be felt deafening. William had thrown himself into work with an intensity that worried her. He was scheduled to visit 3 children's hospitals in the coming week, all institutions where David had been a patron or frequent visitor. Catherine knew her husband was struggling with how to fill the enormous shoes David had left behind, how to continue the work without the guidance of the man who had taught them both so much about connecting with children facing their darkest hours. It was on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after the funeral, that Catherine made a decision that would change everything. She was sitting in her private study, surrounded by the hundreds of letters and drawings that had poured in from children around the world. Each envelope contained a piece of someone's heart, stories about how David's books had helped them through difficult times, drawings of their favorite characters, and letters addressed directly to Uncle David in heaven. One letter in particular caught her attention. It was written in the careful handwriting of a 9-year-old named Emma from Manchester. The paper was decorated with crayon drawings of rainbows and flowers, and the words were simple but profound. Dear Princess Catherine, my mummy says Uncle David can't write any more stories because he's in heaven now. But I think maybe the stories are still inside other people, waiting to come out. Could you help them find their way? Love, Emma. P.S. I'm drawing you a rainbow because Uncle David said rainbows are God's way of showing us that beautiful things come after storms. Catherine read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of wisdom hidden in a child's innocent perspective. Emma was right. David's stories weren't gone. They lived on in every child he had touched, every imagination he had sparked, every dream he had nurtured. But those stories needed new voices, new champions, new ways to reach the children who needed them most. That afternoon, Catherine called William into her study. She found him reviewing briefing papers for the hospital visits, his face drawn with the weight of trying to be everything to everyone while processing his own grief. I want to show you something, she said softly, handing him Emma's letter. William read it slowly, and she watched as something shifted in his expression. The tight lines around his eyes softened, and for the first time since David's death, she saw a glimmer of the man she had fallen in love with beneath the burden of duty and grief. She's remarkable, he said, looking up at Catherine. 9 years old, and she understands something that we've been struggling with all week. Catherine nodded. I've been thinking about what David would want us to do now. Not the official response, not the charitable donations or the memorial services, but what he would really want. William set down his papers and gave her his full attention. What are you thinking? I think he'd want us to find those stories that Emma talks about, the ones that are still inside people, waiting to come out. I think he'd want us to create something that doesn't just honor his memory, but continues his mission. The idea that had been forming in Catherine's mind for days finally crystallized into words. She spoke about establishing a new foundation, one that would support emerging children's authors and illustrators, especially those from underrepresented communities. She envisioned writing workshops in hospitals, storytelling programs in schools, and mobile libraries that could reach children in remote areas. But here's what I think would make David proudest, she continued, her voice growing more animated as the vision became clearer. I think we should write a book ourselves, a collaboration, something that captures what he taught us about resilience, about finding magic in difficult times, about the power of imagination to heal. William was quiet for a long moment, considering the magnitude of what she was suggesting. They had never attempted anything like this before. Their public works had always been about supporting others, not creating something themselves from scratch. You know, we'd be completely out of our depth, he said finally, but Catherine could hear the interest in his voice. Completely, she agreed with a small smile. David always said the best stories come from places where we're vulnerable, where we don't have all the answers. The decision to move forward came naturally, born from their shared grief and their shared love for the man they had lost. They would spend the coming months learning about children's literature, working with editors and illustrators, and most importantly, listening to children themselves about what they needed to hear. Their first step was visiting the Children's Hospital in London, where David had spent countless hours. Catherine had been there before on official visits, but this time felt different. She and William weren't there as royal patrons making a ceremonial appearance. They were there as students, trying to understand what David had known instinctively about connecting with children in their most vulnerable moments. They met with Sarah Chun, the head of the pediatric psychology department, who had worked closely with David for over 15 years. Sarah was a small woman with kind eyes and an infectious laugh, the kind of person who could make a child smile even on their worst day. David had a gift, Sarah explained as she led them through the colorful corridors decorated with murals that David had commissioned from local artists. He understood that sick children don't want to be treated differently. They want to be seen as whole people, not just their diagnosis. His stories always featured characters who were dealing with challenges, but the challenges never defined them. They stopped at the door of the children's library, a bright room filled with beanbags, colorful rugs, and walls lined with books. Through the window, they could see a group of young patients listening to a volunteer read from The Brave Little Hedgehog, one of David's most popular stories about a small creature who discovers that courage isn't about not being afraid, but about doing what's right even when you are afraid. "May we go in?" Catherine asked. Sarah hesitated. "Are you sure? This isn't a formal visit. These children are here for treatment. Some of them are having really difficult days." William and Catherine exchanged a look. This was exactly where they needed to be, in the messy, unpredictable reality of children's lives, not in the sanitized version of royal visits they were used to. Inside the library, 7 children ranging in age from 5 to 12 were scattered around the room. Some were in wheelchairs, others had visible medical equipment, and a few showed the effects of chemotherapy treatments. When William and Catherine entered quietly at the back of the room, a few children glanced their way with mild curiosity, but most remained focused on the story. The volunteer, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson who had been reading to children at the hospital for 20 years, finished the story and began discussing it with the children. "What do you think made the little hedgehog brave?" she asked. A 10-year-old girl named Zora, whose head was covered with a colorful scarf, raised her hand. "He was scared, but he helped his friends anyway. Uncle David always writes about people being scared but doing good things anyway." "That's right," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "Sometimes being brave means doing the right thing, even when we're frightened." A smaller boy, probably 6 years old, piped up from his wheelchair. "My mummy says Uncle David is in heaven now. Do you think he's still writing stories up there?" The question hung in the air, and Catherine felt her heart clench. Mrs. Patterson looked uncertain how to answer, and Catherine found herself stepping forward before she could think twice about protocol. "May I sit with you all for a moment?" she asked the children. The children shifted to make room, and Catherine settled cross-legged on the carpet, William beside her. Up close, she could see the resilience in these young faces, the way they had adapted to circumstances that would challenge many adults. "I think your question about Uncle David is really important," Catherine said to the little boy. "I think he might be writing new kinds of stories now. But I also think he left us with some of his storytelling magic, and maybe it's our job to use it." Zara tilted her head thoughtfully. "What do you mean?" "Well," Catherine continued, feeling her way through an idea that was forming as she spoke. "What if we all have stories inside us? Stories about being brave, or kind, or creative, or funny. What if Uncle David's greatest gift wasn't just the books he wrote, but the way he taught us that we all have stories worth telling?" The children began to share their own stories then. Marcus, 8 years old and dealing with a rare genetic condition, told them about the superhero he had invented in his mind, one whose special power was making people laugh when they were sad. Lily, a 7-year-old with leukemia, described the fairy kingdom she had created in her hospital room, complete with invisible fairies who helped her feel brave during treatments. As Catherine listened, she realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. These children, facing challenges that most adults would find overwhelming, were creating worlds of imagination and hope. They were living proof of everything David had believed about the resilience of young hearts and minds. William, who had been quiet during most of the conversation, finally spoke. "You know what I think Uncle David would say if he were here?" The children looked at him expectantly. "I think he'd say that you're all authors already. You're creating characters and stories and magical worlds every day. And I think he'd be very proud of you." When they left the hospital that evening, Catherine and William rode home in thoughtful silence. They had gone there to learn about David's work, but they had discovered something much more profound. They had seen firsthand the power of imagination to transform even the most difficult circumstances, and They had witnessed the natural storytelling ability that lived within every child. "Did you see their faces?" Catherine asked finally. "When we talked about them being authors, about their stories matching?" William nodded. They lit up. It was like we gave them permission to see themselves differently. That night, Catherine sat in her study long after the rest of the house had gone to sleep. She began writing in a journal, capturing not just the events of the day, but the emotions, the insights, the moments of connection that had felt so precious. Without realizing it, she was beginning to write their book. She wrote about Zara's wisdom, about Marcus's superhero, about Lily's fairy kingdom. She wrote about the way David had seen potential in every child, and about the responsibility that came with that vision. She wrote about grief and hope, about loss and renewal, about the way stories could bridge any gap between one heart and another. When William found her there at midnight, surrounded by pages covered in her handwriting, he didn't interrupt. He simply sat down beside her and began to read what she had written. After a few minutes, he picked up a pen and began adding his own thoughts, his own memories, his own vision for what they were trying to create. They worked together until dawn, two people united in grief and purpose, laying the foundation for something that would honor David's memory while creating new pathways for hope. They didn't know yet what form their book would take or how they would navigate the challenges of becoming authors while fulfilling their royal duties. But they knew they had found their way forward. In the faces of those brave children, in the wisdom of a 9-year-old named Emma, in the enduring power of stories to heal and inspire, they had found the beginning of their answer to loss. They would continue David's work not by trying to replace him, but by becoming the best versions of themselves that his influence had helped create. The sun rose over Windsor Castle, painting the ancient stones in shades of gold and pink, and Catherine and William continued to write, their words weaving together into something that honored the past while reaching toward the future. 3 months had passed since that late-night writing session, and what had begun as a therapeutic exercise had evolved into something far more significant. Catherine stood in the converted study that had become their writing sanctuary, looking at the walls now covered with character sketches, plot outlines, and illustrations sent by children from around the world who had heard about their project. The book had taken on a life of its own. What started as a simple story about resilience had grown into a collaborative effort involving dozens of children, teachers, psychologists, and artists. They had received input from young patients in hospitals, students in inner-city schools, and children in rural communities who had never seen their experiences reflected in literature. The story they were crafting centered around a young girl named Hope who discovers that her grandmother's garden contains magical seeds that grow into trees bearing different kinds of courage. Each tree represented a different way of being brave. The oak of honest words for children who needed to speak difficult truths, the willow of gentle strength for those facing illness or loss, the maple of creative dreams for young people whose imaginations were their greatest assets. But the real magic of the project wasn't in the fantasy elements. It was in how the story had created connections between children who might never meet but shared similar struggles. Letters poured in daily from young readers who had heard about the book and wanted to contribute their own ideas about courage and hope. Catherine was reading one such letter when William entered the room, carrying their morning tea and wearing the expression that had become familiar over the past months. A mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration that came from pushing themselves into unfamiliar territory. "How's the latest chapter coming?" he asked, settling into the chair that had become his designated writing spot. "I think we're close to something special," Catherine replied, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "I just keep wondering if we're doing justice to what David would have wanted." It was a conversation they had regularly. Despite the positive response to their project, both Catherine and William struggled with self-doubt. They were constantly aware that they were operating outside their expertise, venturing into a world where their royal titles meant little and their artistic merits would be judged on their own worth. Their editor, Jamie Sullivan, arrived that morning for what had become a weekly review session. Jamie was a veteran of children's publishing who had worked with David on several projects. She was direct, insightful, and had no patience for the kind of deference that usually surrounded royal projects. "I've read the latest draft," Jamie announced without preamble, settling into the third chair with her characteristic no-nonsense efficiency. "You're overthinking it." William and Catherine exchanged glances. In their months of working with Jamie, they had learned that her blunt assessments, while sometimes difficult to hear, were invaluable. "The technical aspects are fine," Jamie continued. "Your prose is clear, your character development is solid, and the message is authentic. But you're writing like you're afraid of making mistakes instead of writing like you believe in your story." Catherine felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. "What do you mean? You keep second-guessing yourselves," Jamie explained. "David's influence is there in the best possible way, in your commitment to serving children through storytelling. But this isn't David's book. It's yours, and it needs to sound like you, not like an imitation of someone else." The feedback stung because it was accurate. Catherine and William had been so concerned with honoring David's legacy that they had been afraid to let their own voices emerge fully. They had been writing in the shadow of their grief rather than through it. That afternoon, they decided to take a different approach. Instead of working in their usual study, they drove to the primary school in a nearby village where they had arranged to test some of their story ideas with actual children. The school served a diverse community, with students from various economic backgrounds, some dealing with family challenges that mirrored the themes in their book. Mrs. Roberts, the head teacher, greeted them warmly, but with the practical attitude of someone more concerned with her students' well-being than with royal protocol. "The children are excited," she said as she led them to her classroom. "But I should warn you, they're also honest. If they don't like something, they'll let you know." The classroom was filled with 28 children, ages 8 to 10, sitting in a circle on colorful cushions. Catherine and William settled onto child-sized chairs, feeling both nervous and energized by the authenticity of the moment. "We want to tell you a story," Catherine began, "but we also want to know what you think about it. Would that be okay?" The children nodded eagerly, and Catherine began to read from their manuscript. She had chosen a section where hope first discovers the magical garden, a moment that required delicate balance between fantasy and emotional truth. As she read, Catherine watched the children's faces. She saw engagement, curiosity, and the kind of focused attention that indicated a story was working. But when she finished the chapter, she noticed that several children seemed thoughtful rather than excited. "What did you think?" William asked. A girl named Amira raised her hand tentatively. "It's a good story," she said carefully, "but I was wondering something." "What's that?" "Well, Hope finds this magical garden that helps her be brave, right? But what if you don't have a garden? What if you live in a flat and there's no magic anywhere?" The question cut straight to the heart of something Catherine and William had been struggling with. How do you write about finding strength and hope for children whose circumstances offer few obvious sources of either? A boy named Tyler chimed in. "Yeah, and what if being brave doesn't fix anything? What if you're brave, but bad things still happen?" Catherine felt her carefully constructed narrative being gently, but effectively challenged by the very audience it was meant to serve. These children were bringing a level of realism to the discussion that she and William, despite their best intentions, had perhaps been avoiding. "Those are really important questions," William said thoughtfully. "What do you think? How could Hope's story work for someone who doesn't have a magical garden?" What followed was one of the most extraordinary conversations Catherine had ever experienced. The children began building on each other's ideas, creating their own version of a story that was grittier, more realistic, and ultimately more hopeful than anything she and William had written. "Maybe the magic isn't in the garden," suggested a quiet girl named Priya. "Maybe it's in Hope herself, and she just needed somewhere quiet to figure that out. Or maybe," added Tyler, warming to the theme, "maybe Hope realizes that courage isn't about feeling brave. Maybe it's about doing what needs to be done even when you're scared and everything's going wrong." Amira nodded enthusiastically, and maybe she finds out that other people have their own kind of magic. Like, maybe her friend who lives in a flat has really good ideas, or maybe her neighbor who seems mean is actually just sad and needs help. As Catherine listened to these children deconstruct and rebuild their story, she realized they were witnessing something profound. These young people understood instinctively what she and William had been intellectually grappling with. That real hope doesn't come from magical solutions, but from the discovery of inner resources and human connections that were there all along. When they left the school that evening, Catherine and William drove home in contemplative silence. They had pages of notes from their conversation with the children, but more importantly, they had a new understanding of what their story needed to become. "We've been writing about finding courage," Catherine said finally, "but maybe we should be writing about discovering that courage was already there." That night, they began rewriting their book from scratch. Instead of a magical garden that provides courage, Hope discovers an abandoned community garden where she meets other young people dealing with various challenges. Together, they work to restore the garden while sharing their stories and supporting each other. The magic in a new version wasn't supernatural. It was the everyday miracle of human resilience and connection. Hope's courage doesn't come from magical trees, but from the gradual realization that she has been brave all along, in small ways, in daily choices, in the simple act of continuing to care about others despite her own struggles. Catherine found herself writing with a freedom she hadn't felt since the project began. She drew on her own experiences of facing public scrutiny, of learning to find strength in vulnerability, of discovering that authenticity was more powerful than perfection. William contributed his understanding of carrying inherited responsibilities while trying to remain true to personal values. But most importantly, they both wrote from their grief for David, not around it. They allowed his death to inform the story without dominating it. Hope's grandmother, who had planted the original garden, had died before the story begins, but her influence lives on in the seed she planted, the knowledge she shared, and the community she helped create. The rewriting process took 2 intense weeks. Catherine and William worked longer hours than they had since their wedding planning, sustained by a creative energy that felt both exhausting and exhilarating. They argued about character motivations, debated dialogue, and constantly tested their ideas against their memories of David's approach to storytelling. Jamie visited again during this period and immediately noticed the difference in their work. "Now this sounds like your book," she said after reading the new opening chapters. David's influence is still there, but it's woven into something that's unmistakably yours. The validation felt good, but more important was the response they began receiving from the children who had inspired the rewrite. When they returned to the village school to share the new version, the reaction was immediate and powerful. "That's better," Amira announced with the direct honesty that only children possess. "Now it feels real." Tyler nodded in agreement. "And hope isn't perfect, which is good. Perfect people are boring." But it was Priya's comment that moved Catherine most deeply. "I like that Hope's grandma is gone, but still there at the same time. That's how it really works when someone you love dies." As autumn deepened around Windsor, Catherine and William continued refining their story, but they also began planning for what would come next. The book was no longer just a tribute to David. It had become the foundation for a broader initiative to support children's storytelling and creative expression. They had established partnerships with hospitals, schools, and community centers to create writing workshops and storytelling programs. They had commissioned illustrations from young artists whose own stories of resilience mirrored those of their characters. And they had begun planning a foundation that would provide resources and support for emerging children's authors from underrepresented communities. The project had transformed not just their understanding of storytelling, but their approach to their royal roles. They had discovered that their most effective service came not from maintaining distance and dignity, but from authentic engagement and shared vulnerability. One evening, as Catherine put the finishing touches on a particularly difficult chapter about hope learning to accept help from others, she realized how far she and William had traveled from that morning when she had read Emma's letter about stories waiting to be found. They had found those stories, not just in themselves, but in the children who had guided and challenged them throughout the process. David would have been proud, she thought, not just of the book they were creating, but of the way they had allowed themselves to be changed by the work. He had always believed that the best stories transformed both the teller and the audience, creating new possibilities for connection and understanding. Outside her window, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, and Catherine felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this point. The grief for David would always be part of them, but it had become a source of strength rather than paralysis, a foundation for service rather than an obstacle to it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they prepared for the book's publication and the public scrutiny that would accompany it. But tonight, Catherine felt the quiet satisfaction of work well done and purpose clearly found. The launch of Hope's Garden was scheduled for a crisp April morning, exactly 1 year after David's death. Catherine stood before her bedroom mirror once again, but this time she was fastening a brooch that had belonged to David's companion Margaret, who had given it to her the week before. It was a small silver pin shaped like an open book, simple but meaningful, a symbol of the continuing story that they were all part of together. The past 6 months have been a whirlwind of final edits, illustration reviews, and preparations for what had become much more than a book launch. The event would take place simultaneously at 12 locations across the United Kingdom, with Catherine and William participating in a special ceremony at the London Children's Hospital, where their journey had truly begun. The book itself had exceeded everyone's expectations. Early reviews from educators and child psychologists had been overwhelmingly positive, praising not just the story, but the authentic voice and emotional truth that resonated throughout. More importantly, the children who had received advance copies had embraced Hope's story with an enthusiasm that had surprised even the publishers. But for Catherine, the real measure of success wasn't in reviews or sales figures. It was in letters like the one she had received the week before from Zara, the 10-year-old they had met during their first hospital visit. Zara was now 11 and had been declared cancer-free for 6 months. Her letter was short but powerful. Dear Princess Catherine and Prince William, I read your book 3 times already. Hope reminds me of myself, but also of all my friends in the hospital. We all have gardens inside us, don't we? Thank you for showing me that my story matters too. Love, Zara. P.S. I'm writing my own book now about a girl who collects courage like other people collect stamps. Such letters had been arriving daily, each one a reminder of why they had undertaken this challenging journey in the first place. The book had become a bridge between their grief for David and their hope for the future, between their royal duties and their desire to serve in a more personal way. As Catherine made her way to the car that would take them to the launch event, she reflected on how much had changed in the years since David's death. The acute pain of loss had evolved into something more complex, a bittersweet appreciation for his influence that strengthened rather than diminished with time. The Children's Hospital was decorated for the occasion with artwork created by young patients, illustrations inspired by the book, and gardens tended by volunteers who have been working for months to create a real-world version of Hope's magical garden. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. From loss and grief, new growth and beauty could emerge. Catherine and William were greeted by Dr. Sarah Chun, who had become not just a colleague, but a true friend during the months of collaboration. Sarah's department had been instrumental in helping them understand the psychological needs of children facing serious challenges, and her insights had shaped many of the book's most important themes. Are you ready for this? Sarah asked with a smile that mixed excitement with gentle concern. As ready as we'll ever be, William replied, but Catherine could hear the nervousness beneath his confident tone. Despite their growing comfort with the project, today would mark their first major public presentation as authors rather than royal patrons. The main event was held in the hospital's largest conference room, which had been transformed into a storytelling space with comfortable seating, soft lighting, and walls covered with illustrations from book. The audience was deliberately small and intimate. 40 children ranging in age from 6 to 16, their families, hospital staff, and a few carefully selected media representatives. As Catherine looked around the room, she saw familiar faces from their year-long journey. Emma from Manchester was there with her family, wearing a dress covered in rainbow patterns and carrying a notebook filled with her own stories. Marcus, the 8-year-old who had invented the laughing superhero, was sitting in his wheelchair with a cape tied around his shoulders, grinning broadly. Priya, Tyler, and Amira had traveled from their village school, looking both excited and slightly awed by the formal setting. But it was the sight of Margaret, David's longtime companion, sitting quietly in the front row that moved Catherine most deeply. Margaret had become an unexpected ally and friend during the book's creation, sharing stories about David's writing process and offering gentle guidance when Catherine and William struggled with particularly difficult passages. "Before we begin," Catherine said as she and William took their places at the front of the room, "we want to acknowledge that today isn't just about celebrating a new book. It's about remembering someone who taught us all the power of stories to heal, inspire, and connect us to one another." She gestured toward a chair that had been left empty, with a small bouquet of flowers and a worn copy of David's first book placed upon it. "Uncle David isn't here with us today, but his spirit lives on in every story that encourages a child to be brave, every tale that helps someone feel less alone, every book that reminds us that we're all part of a larger story together." The room was quiet for a moment, a respectful silence that acknowledged both loss and continuity. Then, William opened the first copy of Hope's Garden and began to read. The story they had crafted over months of writing, rewriting, and collaboration came alive in William's voice. Catherine watched the faces of their young audience as Hope discovered the abandoned garden, met her new friends, and began the slow process of learning that courage wasn't something she needed to find, but something she already possessed. When William reached the part where Hope realizes that her grandmother's real gift wasn't the garden itself, but the community of caring people she had helped create, Catherine saw tears in Margaret's eyes. She also saw a recognition in the faces of the children, that moment when a story connects with a reader's own experience in a way that feels almost magical. After the reading, they opened the floor for questions and comments. What followed was a discussion that reminded Catherine why they had been drawn to children's literature in the first place. The young audience didn't just ask about plot points or characters. They delved into the deeper themes with a wisdom that adults often lost. "Why didn't you make Hope's problems go away completely?" asked a 12-year-old named David. His parents had named him after Sir David, and he had requested to attend the launch. William considered the question carefully. "Because we wanted Hope's story to be honest. Real problems don't usually disappear completely, but that doesn't mean we can't find ways to live with them and help each other." A 14-year-old girl named Rachel, who was attending via video link from a hospital in Scotland, posed a different kind of challenge. "Are you going to write more books?" "Because Hope's story feels like it's just beginning." Catherine and William exchanged glances. They had deliberately left Hope's story with room for continuation, but they hadn't yet committed to a series. "What do you think we should do?" Catherine asked. "Should there be more books about Hope?" The unanimous response from the young audience was enthusiastic approval, accompanied by suggestions for future adventures that demonstrated both creativity and deep understanding of the character they had come to love. As the formal event concluded and moved into a more casual reception, Catherine found herself in conversation with individual children and families. Each interaction reinforced her understanding of why this work mattered and how it connected to their broader mission of service. She spent several minutes talking with a 9-year-old named Jamie, whose family had recently moved to the UK from Syria. Jamie's mother explained that her son had been struggling with language barriers and cultural adjustment, but Hope's story had given him vocabulary for discussing his own experiences of finding courage in unfamiliar circumstances. Jamie has been telling everyone about Hope's Garden, his mother said. He says that learning English is like planting new words in his brain garden. The afternoon's most powerful moment came when Zara approached Catherine carrying a carefully wrapped package. "I made something for you," she said shyly. Inside the package was a hand-sewn book, illustrated with colored pencils, and filled with Zara's own story about a girl who collects different types of courage. The writing was honest, funny, and occasionally heartbreaking, but it was infused with the kind of hope that only comes from having survived real challenges. "This is extraordinary," Catherine told her. "You're already a wonderful author." "Uncle David always said that everyone has stories inside them," Zara replied. "Your book helped me find mine." As the day wound down and the families began to leave, Catherine and William found themselves alone with Margaret in the garden area of the hospital. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the newly planted beds, where seeds donated by children from around the country were beginning to show their first green shoots. "He would have been so proud," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying a year's worth of grief and gratitude. "We hope so," Catherine replied. "We try to honor what he taught us while finding our own voice." Margaret smiled. "You did more than honor him. You understood something that took me years to learn about David's work. The best tribute to a great teacher isn't imitation. It's the courage to become who they helped you discover you could be." That evening, Catherine and William returned to Windsor Castle, emotionally drained but deeply satisfied. The book launch had been everything they had hoped for, and more. But more than the event itself, the entire year-long journey had transformed their understanding of their roles, their relationship, and their capacity to serve others. They had begun the project as a way to process their grief for David, but it had evolved into something much larger, a discovery of their own ability to create, to inspire, and to connect with people in ways that transcended their royal titles. Later that night, as Catherine reviewed the notes and feedback from the day's events, she came across a drawing that one of the younger children had left behind. It showed Hope in her garden, but she wasn't alone. Surrounding her were dozens of other children, all tending their own small plots, all connected by paths that wove between the individual gardens to create a larger, shared space. At the bottom of the drawing, in crayon letters, the child had written, "Hope's garden grows bigger when everyone helps." Catherine smiled, understanding that the young artist had captured something essential about what they had all learned together. David's death had created a void that could never be filled, but from that space, new growth had emerged. The grief had been transformed into purpose, the loss into connection, the ending into a new beginning. The foundation they had established was already funding writing programs in schools and hospitals across the country. Plans were underway for a series of community gardens where children could both grow plants and share stories. And yes, there would be more books about hope, co-authored with some of the young writers who had inspired the original story. Most importantly, Catherine and William had discovered that their greatest service came not from maintaining distance and dignity, but from embracing vulnerability and authentic connection. They had learned to honor the past while creating something new, to carry grief without being crushed by it, and to find hope not in spite of loss, but because of what loss had taught them about what truly mattered. As she prepared for bed, Catherine thought about David one more time. She could almost hear his voice, gentle and encouraging, reminding her that the best stories never really end. They just grow into new stories, told by new voices, reaching new hearts that are ready to believe in the possibility of courage, kindness, and hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve. There would be more children to meet, more stories to nurture, more ways to honor David's memory by continuing to grow the garden of imagination and compassion that he had helped plant in so many hearts. But tonight, Catherine felt the deep peace that comes from work well done and purpose clearly found. The nation's grief for David would never completely fade, but It had been transformed into something beautiful and lasting, a commitment to ensuring that every child knew their story mattered, their courage was real, and their hope was justified. In gardens across the country, seeds planted by children's hands were taking root in soil nourished by tears, tended with love, and sustained by the unshakable belief that from endings come new beginnings, from loss comes wisdom, and from the depths of grief can grow the most extraordinary hope.